is Lindsay. Thank you so much for joining me here again this afternoon. The sun is setting, so hopefully we can get this video out before all my daylight is gone, but it looks really nice right now, so if the sky gets pink or grey in the meantime, I apologize. Let's see how fast we can do this. Okay, so today we are going to be jumping into the story of the Bible. What? That's a little bit different. No, but actually we're going to be talking about the meta story of the Bible, not any specific story within the Bible, but just backing it up a little bit and having a bit more of a broad overview. Just last night I picked up this book that I read about halfway through a couple of years ago. Somebody got this for me as a gift, and honestly, it's a great book, but it's a little bit, it's definitely a lot of theology, and so sometimes a bit too much of that in one hit can fry your brain. So I put it aside when I got about halfway through, and I picked it up again recently, and I was reading, and this one sentence really stood out to me, and I want to share it with you before we do anything else. It says, "We're simply not going to get from the Bible what it has to offer unless we start reading it as a whole and track with its narrative flow." This is by Ty Gibson. It's called The Sonship of Christ, and that passage is found on page 145 if you want to go check that out. There will be a link in the description below if you want to go and purchase that. Anyway, so the idea here is that we need to be looking at the Bible in its fullness, in everything that it has to offer us, and not just be cherry picking little bits, okay? So if we're going to do that, we need to understand that the Bible was written, even though it was written over literally thousands of years and by like 40 different people over this span of time, it was inspired by God. It has a lot of purpose, but it also has this greater overarching theme that ties it all together from beginning to end and everything in between. It's all pointing to this one thing. And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. This one thing is Jesus, right? But what is Jesus doing, and why does he have to do it? So we all know about this idea of sin and redemption, right? This is all pointing towards how Jesus has stepped in to save us and to bring us back into this right relationship with the Father, okay? So when we look at each of the individual stories along the way in the Bible, we see a whole bunch of really interesting moments that sometimes make us scratch our heads a little bit and go, what is going on here? What is God doing here? Why is God allowing these things to happen? Why is he causing things to happen in the way that they are, perhaps? So I have a couple of examples. The first one is found in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 14. If you have a look at that, I'm just going to quickly overview it. Basically what's going on here is this is the chapter where God is making a covenant with Abraham, and he has this conversation, says, hey, I'm going to give you a son from your own body, not just any old guy to inherit your stuff, but you're going to get a son. And this is when Abraham's about 75 years old, and he has to wait a further 25 years before that promise is fulfilled. But that's not the only thing that is promised and foretold in this conversation. So as this is happening, there is a covenant sacrifice that is being made, and then Abraham goes into this deep, terrifying nightmare, essentially, where he is experiencing all sorts of stuff, and God is showing him a bit of the future, and he's speaking to him, and he says this one interesting thing. He says that basically your descendants are going to be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years, and then I'm going to bring them out, and then they're going to have lots of great possessions, but you're not going to experience this. You're going to go to your death in a good old age. You're going to go to your death in peace. You won't experience any of that, what is to come. And so this is a moment where we see that God's plan is not just about Abraham getting Isaac. And it's not just about Isaac and his son Jacob. It's actually going way beyond that. It's saying that there are going to be a lot of descendants. Like God's already told him, you're going to have descendants that you can't even count, like the sand of the seashore or the stars of the heaven, anything like that. You're going to have a lot of descendants, but there's going to be one very specific one that's coming along the line that it's all about, really. There's a lot more to this story than just the next generation or two, right? And so Abraham comes out of this deep sleep and goes about his life. But it's really interesting to me that God foretells this 400 years of slavery, which when we jump into Exodus chapter 1 is exactly where we find the Israelites. Jacob and his sons and his household came as 70 people from Canaan during the time of the 7 years of famine, and they moved to Egypt when Joseph was the prime minister there. And excuse me, there is a dog here who's saying hello to the neighbors. They start as 70 people, and then 400 years later we find that they're around about 5 million people. This is what the theologians have estimated that the size of the nation of Israel was as they were going through the Exodus, about 5 million people. So in 400 years, the nation of Israel it started out as this tiny little tribe, and now it's blossomed into this enormous nation. Now, it's really interesting that the setting that this happens is in the land and within the parameters of Egypt. Now, a little bit of backstory about Egypt. The Egyptians were a really racist group of people. They believed that they were the only true humans, essentially, and that all other peoples of the planet actually sprung up from the dung of the gods, okay? So they believed that any other people groups were less than human. They called them barbarians, essentially. And so because of this mindset, when the Israelites came to live in the land of Egypt, because Joseph was in charge and he did whatever he wanted, essentially, and everyone was on his good side, and so it all worked out. But even though that happened, there was still this massive segregation taking place, and so the Israelites were not like intermarrying with the Egyptians. There was nowhere near as much intermingling or taking on of each other's cultures as you might at first imagine. So when 400 years have gone past, just at the end of this time period is when the Israelites have actually become enslaved. They were living freely for quite a while, and then only the last generation of this nation of Israel being there, they became slaves, and they were forced into, hard labor in the last 100 or so years. And now that they are experiencing this oppression was at the same time where they were actually now a big enough nation for God to say, all right, we're going to take you out of this land of Egypt and take you to the promised land. So essentially, Egypt was for the Israelites a place and a time of incubation. It was a time for them to be growing as this newborn child of a nation. So God placed them in the most powerful and prosperous empire of the world at the time. They had all the protection that they wanted and needed and desired. And then at the same time, they were not becoming a part of the Egyptians. It was a really interesting place to be, a really interesting culture to be growing up in. So now God has called them out, and he's bringing them out with a great and mighty hand and judging the sins of the Egyptians at the same time as delivering, not only rescuing, that sense of delivering, but also delivering as in there's this brand new birth of this, baby newborn child of a nation coming out. He's delivering this baby nation and bringing them into the promised land. So the next thing that we see happen is that the Israelites are coming on this little 11-day journey from Egypt to Canaan. It would only take about 11 days to walk that distance. And as they do so, they are just not ready to enter the land. God would gladly take them into the land if they would cooperate and if they would be obedient and have faith and trust in him. But because of the more recent conditioning of their minds of, being told and treated like slaves for the last 100 or so years, they couldn't understand and they couldn't actually trust God. Only a couple of people in the entire nation of Israel actually had the faith required to trust God. They chose to trust God and chose to have courage, but they couldn't save the rest of the nation. And so God allowed them to enter the promised land 40 years later, but everyone else over the age of 20 who were considered adults, they were condemned to die in the wilderness. And so at first glance, you might think that this entire generation of about 5 million people wandering around the wilderness for 40 years, that's like such a waste of a life, right? But if you come at it from the perspective of the greater story that God has in store, you know, he's got the sin, salvation, redemption, second coming of Jesus, all that plan in mind. And this is just a teeny tiny little portion of that, right? So the 400 years of slavery or being strangers in this foreign land and then becoming slaves towards the end. And then this 40 years, this one generation of people wandering in the wilderness and dying out, living out their days and dying there and not seeing the promised land. That was a single generation that experienced that, compared to the many, many generations afterwards that were in the promised land, and even though they were messing up a whole bunch, that actually led to the ability for Jesus to be born, and then he could die, and then he could save us from our sins and bring us into this right relationship with God the Father. So when we look at situations in life, whether it's in the Bible specifically, like what is going on, why is God allowing that to happen, or if we're looking at our own lives and going, why am I experiencing all this suffering? Why are these group of people experiencing this kind of suffering? What is going on? Sometimes we need to zoom out a little bit and go, what is the greatest story of the universe, of God's plan of salvation and redemption? What is this little part of the story? Where does that fit in the greater story of things? Okay, so the Israelites walking in the wilderness for 40 years, that was so that this new generation who did enter the promised land, they could have been trained up from their childhood, because it was basically anyone under the age of 20 from the Exodus time, from walking out of Egypt to now moving in to the land of Egypt at the ripe old age of 60, for the oldest ones except for Joshua and Caleb. They were trained up their whole lives to see God in action, right? They saw the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day. They had the tabernacle in their midst, leading them in every direction that they needed. They had the manna from heaven every day except for Saturday. They had their clothes never ever wore out. Their sandals never wore out. They never needed a new change. They had all these miracles and they had all these experiences where God was providing for them. And so they had this very tangible upbringing with God's presence in their midst, compared to their parents who were needing to die out in this wilderness because their slave mindset, they just couldn't get past that and actually trust God, right? So this new generation needed this wilderness experience to be trained to trust God and to conquer as they entered the land, right? So when we experience situations that are similar in our own lives, we might be able to think, okay, what am I going through here now? And what needs to die in this wilderness? And what needs to be trained up? What do I need to experience of God? What is it that God is trying to teach me about himself and about myself, and what needs to be pruned and grown and developed? What part of my character needs to develop before I can move into the promised land and conquer? And how does this fit into the overall plan that God has for the universe? These are really big themes to keep in mind, but if we do not keep them in mind, we miss the point that each story in the Bible is trying to tell us. So I want to give you a little bit of my own backstory where I experienced this. Now, I think I've shared this a few times now, maybe, and let me tell you one word: humility. If that rings a bell, then yeah, I've told you a few times by now. So in January 2017, I was volunteering as a staff member at a summer camp, for a Christian summer camp in New South Wales, and I was there for about 2 weeks, I think. And in this space of 2 weeks, I heard the word humility 3 times, okay? And after the first 2 times, I was starting to question God, hey, are you trying to tell me something here? And then immediately after that, I heard it for the 3rd time. I was like, okay, I think I hear you, God. I've never had a word of the year or a word from God in that kind of way before, but I very strongly felt that God was trying to say, Lindsay, this year you're going to learn about humility. And I was not really excited about that at all, I promise. This is a bit tricky, but basically in my family, there are some family members who are very prideful and arrogant and narcissistic, and when you grow up with that around you, you kind of take on some of those traits as well. So I'm not going to lie, I've definitely identified some of those traits in my own life. And knowing from a young age, from the age of 13, that God had called me into ministry, it's really important to know that if you're going to be doing ministry of any description and serving people for God, you cannot have pride, arrogance, narcissism, or anything like that in your life. There are quite a few people who are ministers who definitely come up on all of these things. There was actually some studies done a few years ago. I learned this while I was studying a psychology for ministry class, that in one particular denomination in Canada, they surveyed all of the ministers of this denomination in a kind of subtle way, in that when they got the results back, they found out about 1/3 of the ministers came up as having narcissistic traits to some degree. And it's really interesting that the professions of ministry, of being a doctor and being in the armed forces or in the police forces, these 3 types of positions attract people with narcissistic disorders. And there is a very high proportion of people with that who go into these professions, because it's actually an interesting dynamic where these are people of power or of influence. For example, in ministry of spiritual influence with medicine, it's about, I have the power of life and death over you. So the people who have these tendencies psychologically tend to be attracted to these kind of positions, because they have vulnerable people who are going to look up to them and say, please teach me the way of life. Please give me life, whether that's spiritual or medical or whatever, or, you know, being protected by enemies, whether it's in the armed forces or police service or whatever. So these people are attracted to those positions because they get to have a kick out of essentially, you know, saving, protecting, giving life to everyone else. And it kind of becomes all about them. But they also tend to be very intelligent people who know how to manipulate it so it doesn't look like that. So knowing what I know, I learned that a couple of years ago, and I found that really an important thing to reflect on. And I know I don't want to be a person who is attracted to ministry because of these tendencies, or go into ministry still having these tendencies, if they do exist in the first place, which, you know, if God's telling me about humility, then I definitely have pride that needs to be undone to some degree. So, and I know for sure I definitely still have pride that I'm working on with God. So for God to say, hey Lindsay, we're going to be looking at humility this year, I was not keen, and it was not a fun year, I promise you. I went through quite a bit that year. I had health problems. I had a whole bunch of things that I'd put on my plate for academically, and for all sorts of other different types of achievements that I wanted to reach that year, just to see if I could make it in this world, just as like a measurement of the type of success that I could succeed. And when I did that, I found that I failed at everything, and my health was failing, and it was just such a rough time that I even had a friend just say, hey Lindsay, you've had a really hard life up till now, why don't you just give yourself a break and, you know, just stop uni for a while, maybe stop studying, maybe get a job, do something you enjoy, I don't know, just take a break for yourself. And so what did I do? Halfway through this year of humility, I decided, I'll go and be a volunteer missionary, which turns out was not the best experience either. I had already experienced being a mission kid in a third world country when I was a teenager, and I was like, I got this, you know? But at this point in my life, I was actually not looking after my spiritual health or any other part of my health at this point. And to go into ministry and to go into missionary work especially, like Satan has already like got a mark on you, you're going to be attacked. But it's really no good if you're helping him out by not looking after your spiritual health and allowing Satan to have access to your life. So for me, that came in the form of, I had some friends who encouraged me to get into Game of Thrones a few years before that, and so I was really into watching Game of Thrones. I know that is a big no-no. Some of you guys might be enjoying it still, but for me, when I just started my volunteer missionary time, that was when the new season of Game of Thrones had just come out, and so I was consuming that on the weekly basis. And because of that, it's such a satanic show, guys. Please, if you haven't watched it, don't watch it. If you are enjoying that or anything similar to it, please pray about it before you keep watching any more of it, or reading or listening or anything along those lines. Have a chat to God about, is this healthy for me spiritually? Anyway, so I was engaging in that kind of material, and because of it, I noticed within myself that it was tough because, first of all, I was isolated. I was in like a completely different time zone from the rest of my family. There was only a very tiny patch of time in the week that I could actually reach out and talk to my family or friends back in Australia, and the people that I was living with were not the most engaging to be with. And one person in particular, I didn't like her from the get-go, and that's on me that I wasn't treating her well. And so with all of these different things put together, I experienced a lot of a spiritual attack, and I engaged in things that I shouldn't have been engaging in. And so the way that I ended up behaving was not good, and it made enemies for myself. And so after about 5 months of being there, I was told that, hey, we've booked your ticket, you're going to go back to Australia. And I had literally 2 days notice, and that was it. And I was out of there. I basically got kicked out of being a missionary. That's not something you want to brag about, I promise, but I want to share this with you guys because it's really important. I need you to catch this. That was the end of that first year of learning about humility. And boy, did I learn about humility that year. I was so humbled. I was even humbled in what it means to be a missionary. So now, 4 years after that, and this year God has reminded me at the start of the year again more about humility. So I hadn't quite fully learnt the lesson that year. This learning about humility for me specifically, and going through that really tough year that you might call a wilderness journey, was really important to shape me for who I am now and for what God is calling me into. God has called me into ministry, and I am now moving into a new ministry role this coming year, which is really exciting, but it's also very sobering because it comes with a lot of responsibility once again, and a lot of personal responsibility of my own spiritual health and my own emotional and mental health, right? So I've gone through these humbling experiences, learning about humility, learning about getting rid of any pride that is there, right? Learning to be vulnerable and open and process emotions and be healthy emotionally. So that season of life, if we look at it from the perspective of the overarching theme of the universe and what God is doing, my little part of the story in 2017 of the year of humility has been able to be that wilderness journey where pride, for the most part, was killed off, right? So I could move into this victorious new promised land, so God could bring me into ministry. It wasn't until 2019 that I really started working in ministry, okay? So that was 2 whole years before the start of ministry that I went through that really, really tough time. And honestly, I've had a lot of tough years in different ways prior to that as well, and even since then, in different ones, but that specific year was about humility and about being able to emulate the character of Jesus and the Trinity. Because if God is anything, the Godhead, the three, if God is anything, he is humble. You always see that God the Father is saying, hey, look at my Son, and Jesus, the Son, saying, hey, look at the Father, and the Holy Spirit saying, hey, look at the both of them, you know, like they're always saying, hey, look at the other one. I want to show you, you know, how amazing that one is. It's never about myself, like look at me, right? It's always about, let me show you Jesus, let me show you the Father, right? So if Jesus, if God, if the Holy Spirit, if all of them are any one thing, it is humble. And I'm so glad that God has been teaching me this over the years, right? I'm so glad. It has really helped me and shaped who I am, and I'm very grateful for that experience. So I want to encourage you guys that if you are going through any kind of difficult experiences or anything like that, maybe just sit back and have a think and chat to God and say, hey, what is it about this experience that you're trying to teach me? What has this got to do with your overarching plan? Because for me, where I'm at now, going into ministry, again, some more, in this state of humility, more so than I was before, and I will continue to grow on this one my whole life. So that's important for the overarching theme of the universe because of this great conflict between the forces of good and evil, and for getting to this stage where it is all completely final, right? Yes, Jesus has finalized salvation on the cross, but we're still working towards Jesus' soon return and evangelizing and telling the gospel to everyone else. So right now, my job is empowering you guys and empowering the people around me to go and share the gospel to other people. And if I didn't have that experience with humility a couple of years ago, then I would not be in this position to help, encourage, and empower the people around me and you guys to do that, and so we could bring the gospel to the rest of the world. Okay, so I want you to see that and have a look at your own life and say, hey God, what are you doing in my life, and how can I cooperate with you a little bit better in this season? So that's all that I have for you guys today. Please check out the link in the description below if you do want to check out that book by Ty Gibson. Also, please leave a comment in the comment section below if you found anything helpful or inspiring about this video. And please consider liking, subscribing, sharing this with a friend. It all really helps getting this message out to other people who might be blessed by this. All right, thank you guys. I will see you again next Friday. See ya.